Illinois corn farmers are spending $229 per acre on fertilizer this spring, over $114,000 before a single seed goes in the ground. Meanwhile, CF Industries, one of three companies controlling 93% of North American nitrogen fertilizer, reported a 547% profit increase the last time this happened. This is not a supply chain problem. This is a system working exactly as it was designed. And to understand how the world's food system became this dependent on three companies, we have to go back 100 years to a German laboratory and a discovery that saved billions of lives while quietly building the most profitable dependency in agricultural history. This video follows that trail. From a 1973 oil shock to a 2022 food crisis to a spring 2026 planting season that is breaking farmers in real time. The same pattern, the same beneficiaries, and a system so deeply embedded in the soil itself that most farmers alive today have never known anything different. Let's start with where things stand right now, because the scale of what is happening this spring needs to be understood before anything else. The Iran conflict has disrupted fertilizer supply chains at the worst possible moment. Spring planting is not a flexible window. The decisions about what fertilizer to buy, how much to apply, and when to put it in the ground must be made within a narrow period in April and May. Miss that window, and there is no recovery. A corn crop planted in July is not a corn crop. It is a loss. Illinois corn farmers are projecting $229 per acre in fertilizer costs this season, according to Phycoterra's April 2026 agricultural analysis. For a 500-acre operation, that is $114,500 in input costs before machinery, seed, labor, or land. And that figure assumes the farmer can source what they need at current prices, which, as of spring 2026, is not guaranteed. For the home gardener, the pressure registers differently, but it is equally real. The bag of balanced fertilizer that cost $12 3 years ago now costs $19 or $22, depending on where you shop. The product has not changed. The bag has not changed. The price reflects something that has nothing to do with what is inside it and everything to do with who controls the supply. According to Markets and Markets, research published in June 2026, the global crop protection chemicals market is currently valued at $83.32 billion and is projected to reach $106.26 billion by 2030. That is a $23 billion projected revenue increase for the corporations supplying the chemicals that farmers cannot afford. Over the same 5 years, during which those farmers will continue to face the shortages driving those prices upward. That is not coincidence. That is the system operating as designed. Now here is what the coverage of this shortage is not telling you. This is not the first time this has happened. It is not the second time. If you track the last 50 years of fertilizer crises, the price spikes, the supply disruptions, the farm bankruptcies, the food price cascades that follow, the same small group of companies appears on the profitable side of every single one. 3 companies control 93% of nitrogen fertilizer sales in North America. According to Farm Action's Agriculture Consolidation Data Hub, those 3 companies are CF Industries, Nutrien, and Koch. 93% of a market this size means there is no alternative when supply breaks. No competing supplier to absorb demand. No regional production network to fill the gap. The dependency is structural, and it is total. That concentration did not emerge from market efficiency. It was constructed through decades of deliberate acquisitions, the systematic purchase of competing regional manufacturers, and the quiet closure of production facilities that would have provided the redundancy capable of softening every crisis since. The pattern did not begin in 2026. To understand why 2026 was inevitable, you have to go back to the last time this happened, and the time before that. The first modern fertilizer crisis occurred in 1973. And to understand why 2026 was inevitable, you need to understand not just what happened, but what was deliberately not done about it afterward. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is produced through the Haber-Bosch process, a chemical reaction that requires natural gas as its primary feedstock. Natural gas is a fossil fuel traded on commodity markets governed entirely by geopolitical relationships that have nothing to do with farming. That structural vulnerability was known and documented before 1973. It was never corrected. When OPEC restricted oil supply in October 1973, natural gas prices followed within weeks. According to the USDA Economic Research Service, U.S. fertilizer prices increased by approximately 75% between 1972 and 1974. Farmers who could not absorb that increase reduced their plantings. Global grain reserves fell. The FAO declared the 1973 to 1974 period a world food crisis. The company that would eventually become today's CF Industries, then operating regional nitrogen facilities across the U.S. Midwest, reported significantly improved margins during that price spike. The pattern of supply disruption producing corporate profitability was documented in that first crisis. It was not treated as a warning. It was absorbed as a normal market outcome. What happened next is the detail that changes everything. The United States government's response to the 1973 food and fertilizer crisis was not to reduce the food system's dependency on synthetic nitrogen. It was the opposite. The Nixon administration's agricultural policy, built on USDA Secretary Earl Butz's directive to farmers to plant fence row to fence row, locked American agriculture deeper into high-input commodity production. More acres, more synthetic fertilizer, more natural gas dependency. A supply chain that was now structurally larger and more concentrated than it had been before the crisis it had just created. By 1974, the vulnerability was greater than it had been in 1972. The corporations supplying the inputs were more concentrated, and the architecture of the next crisis was already in place. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to explain as coincidence. Because 49 years later, with a different conflict and a different decade, the same sequence ran again. Step for step. Russia and Belarus together supply approximately 40% of the world's potash. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of ammonia, a key ingredient in nitrogen fertilizer production. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, global fertilizer prices spiked to levels not seen since the 2008 food crisis. Within weeks of the invasion, the FAO Food Price Index reached 159.7 points in March 2022, its highest recorded level since the index began in 1990. The World Food Programme's 2022 Global Food Crisis Report documented that 49 million people across 49 countries were pushed to emergency levels of food insecurity, with fertilizer price increases cited as a primary contributing factor in agriculturally dependent nations. While that was happening, CF Industries reported full-year 2022 net earnings of $3.3 billion. In 2021, the same company reported net earnings of $510 million. That is a 547% increase in a single year. During a global food crisis, while farmers worldwide could not afford to plant, Nutrien reported 2022 adjusted EBITDA of $10.9 billion, more than double its 2021 figure of $5.0 billion. The company used a significant portion of those record profits not to expand production capacity, but to execute a $4 billion stock buyback program. 49 million people pushed toward starvation. And the industry's response was a $4 billion stock buyback. That is not a reaction to a crisis. That is a company that knew exactly what the crisis was worth. Here is the part the earnings press releases did not mention. Neither company made significant investment in expanding North American production capacity during or after the 2022 crisis. Not because expansion was technically impossible, because expanding capacity would increase supply. Increasing supply would reduce scarcity. And scarcity is precisely what makes the system profitable. A well-supplied fertilizer market is a lower-margin fertilizer market. The shortage is not a problem the industry is working to solve. The shortage is a condition the industry has learned to price. Now, the most common objection to everything you have just heard is that this is simply supply and demand. Conflicts disrupt supply chains, prices rise, companies profit. That is how commodity markets work, and that objection is partially correct. Geopolitical events do create genuine supply disruptions. But it misses the central question this investigation is asking. The question is not why the supply chain broke. The question is why the entire global food system was built to depend on a supply chain with no redundancy, no regional alternatives, and no biological substitute, controlled by three companies. That was always one conflict away from breaking. Supply and demand explains the price movement. It does not explain the architecture that guaranteed every price movement would benefit the same three companies. That architecture was not created by market forces. It was built through acquisition, through the systematic closure of competing regional production facilities, and through the defunding of the natural fertility research that might have given farmers a way out. If you have been watching this investigation and you are beginning to understand the shape of what this system actually is, this channel exists to document exactly this pattern. Subscribe to Harvest Origins. Because the next video goes all the way back to the origin of this dependency, to the German laboratory where a scientist invented the process that fed the world and then used the same chemistry to help kill millions. That origin story is the foundation of every fertilizer crisis you have just watched. You will want to be here for it. Which brings us to today. And here is why the third instance of this pattern is the most significant. Because this time, there is a 50-year documented record sitting behind it. The Iran conflict has disrupted fertilizer supply chains during the precise moment of maximum agricultural vulnerability. The same three companies, controlling 93% of North American nitrogen supply, are facing the same supply pressure that produced 547% profit increases in 2022. The farmer still has no alternative. The home gardener still has no alternative, and the financial analysts covering the fertilizer sector are already revising earnings estimates upward for the companies holding the supply. The pattern is not a theory. It is a documented sequence that has repeated across three separate geopolitical crises spanning 5 decades. Different conflicts, different decades, same corporations, same outcome, same farmers paying. But here's the question the shortage coverage never asks, and it is the most important question in this entire investigation. Why does the entire global food system depend on a supply chain that breaks every time a conflict starts? That dependency did not happen by accident. It was built deliberately over a century. And building it required the systematic dismantling of the natural fertility systems that had sustained agriculture for 10,000 years before any of these corporations existed. The corporations did not just acquire the fertilizer market. They helped dismantle the only system that could have replaced it, the biological fertility that farmers had relied on for 10,000 years. And they did it so thoroughly that most farmers alive today have never farmed without synthetic inputs. Before the Haber-Bosch process was industrialized at scale, farming operated on closed nutrient cycles. Compost, manure, crop rotation, leguminous cover crops, clover, vetch, beans, that fixed atmospheric nitrogen directly into the soil through their root systems. These were not primitive practices. They were self-sustaining biological systems that required no external inputs, no fossil fuel supply chains, and no corporate supplier to function. The transition from those systems to synthetic nitrogen dependency was actively promoted by USDA extension programs, by international agricultural development institutions, including the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, and by land-grant universities whose research departments received funding from the same chemical corporations manufacturing the fertilizer they were recommending. The promotional infrastructure and the profit motive pointed in the same direction. And here is the mechanism that made the dependency permanent, biological, rather than merely economic. A December 2025 study published in the journal Soil Biology and Biochemistry, examining 40 years of microbiome data from continuously fertilized farmland, found that synthetic nitrogen fertilizers disrupt the stable biological relationship between protostan predators and bacterial populations in soil, reducing the microbial diversity that creates natural nitrogen availability. Research covered by Beyond Pesticides in their December 2025 analysis documented that this disruption compounds over successive growing seasons. The longer a farm operates on synthetic inputs, the less capable its soil biology becomes of supporting natural fertility. The farmer cannot go back. Not because natural farming is theoretically impossible, but because the soil that would support it has been chemically altered to the point where returning requires years of biological rebuilding, years during which yields fall below commercially viable levels for most operations. The dependency is not just economic, it is written into the soil itself. The land has been restructured to require the product, and every spring planting season, every bag purchased at the garden center, every ton applied to a commercial field, deepens that restructuring one more season. And this is where the investigation becomes personal. Every bag of fertilizer purchased at a garden center is a transaction inside a system whose architecture was decided before most of today's gardeners were born. Not because any individual gardener did something wrong, but because the alternative was removed from the commercial market so thoroughly and so systematically that most people growing food today have no living memory of a time when it existed. The vegetable garden that required $40 of fertilizer inputs 3 years ago requires $70 today. Not because the soil needs more, but because the soil biology that could have supplied those nutrients naturally was degraded by the same chemical inputs applied in previous seasons. The product creates the need for more of the product. That is not a side effect. That is the design. The food on grocery store shelves reflects fertilizer price increases with a 6 to 9 month lag. The disruption happening in spring 2026 will be visible in food prices before the end of this year, not as a fertilizer story, but as an inflation story, a supply chain story, a geopolitical consequence story. Every framing except the accurate one. A 2025 study published in Science, led by researchers at Beijing Normal University and drawing on data from 1,620 contaminated soil sites across 116 countries, documented that global soil pollution from agricultural chemical inputs now threatens both agricultural productivity and human health. At a scale, researchers have only recently begun to fully measure. The long-term cost of the dependency is not paid only in dollars at the garden center. It is paid in the biological capacity of the soil itself, a capacity that once lost takes decades to restore, and that no shortage-driven price spike will ever incentivize the fertilizer industry to rebuild. The shortage is not the problem. The shortage is the symptom. The problem is a system that made the shortage mathematically inevitable, that built a global food supply on a single point of failure, controlled by 3 companies, dependent on a fossil fuel supply chain, and positioned to extract maximum profit from every geopolitical disruption that breaks it. The 2026 crisis, the 2022 crisis, the 1973 crisis. 3 different conflicts, 3 different decades, 1 recurring outcome, and 1 recurring set of beneficiaries. But none of this explains how the world arrived here. How the most fundamental input in global agriculture came to be controlled by three companies, produced through a single chemical process, dependent on fossil fuels, and structurally incapable of surviving a geopolitical shock without triggering a food crisis. That story starts in a German laboratory in 1909, with a scientist named Fritz Haber, who solved one of the most catastrophic problems in human history, and in doing so, created the conditions for every crisis you have just watched. The same man who earned the Nobel Prize for feeding the world also personally directed the first large-scale chemical weapons attack in modern warfare. And the process he invented is what every bag of fertilizer on Earth is based on today. That investigation is next. If this one mattered to you, share it with one person who buys food. That is how this kind of information travels. The next video is right here.